Thanks. All right, thanks. Well, thanks so much for being here. I know it's Friday night, March Madness. My bracket is already completely busted, but I will still be watching some of the games later today. So good to see everyone, some definite old friends and some new friends as well. So the title of my talk tonight is What Makes Humans Valuable? And I really think that this question, especially for me as a physician who cares immensely about life, as we all should, is one of the most pressing, important questions actually of our time. And I hope to get your input on what you think makes humans valuable and share my musings on this topic as well, and then spend some time in Q&A. So I don't have any disclosures. My goals for the talk are the following. So we know that people and physicians, right, think about human beings in various ways. And there are consequences, actually, to the way we think about human beings and the value that we see in human beings. So we're going to explore those. We're going to consider, especially because this is the Christian Study Center, what the religious traditions, namely Christianity, has to offer into the cultural conversation at large about the value of human life. We're going to understand the consequences of not having a proper view of human value, using medicine as an example of what can happen. And I really hope to encourage you to be able to give your voice into the public space or into your workplace to speak to the sanctity and the inherent worth and the inviolable dignity of all human beings. And we're going to talk about how to give in a way that's hopefully in charity and humility, especially with people whom you may disagree. And then using the white coat ceremony as an example of what happened to our community this summer, explore the risks of actually having a distinctly Christian view of the human person and how to navigate those challenges. So my only disclaimer is that I'm likely going to say things in my remarks tonight that are challenging. Many of you may disagree with some of my remarks, and I think it's pretty boring to have a conversation with a group of people if we all think this. What I do not hope to happen, but may happen anyway, is that I say something that offends somebody because of my own ineloquence or clumsiness. And if I do that inadvertently, I apologize in advance. All right. So the questions I want to start with and I want your input in are the following. Do human beings all have equal value? Why or why not? And what concerns you? And what, if anything, do your faith traditions, and Christianity in particular, have to offer to this discourse? Thoughts about how you think about the locus of human value, human dignity? Anybody? Yes? Okay, for the purpose of the recording, the scripture made in the image of God. And this is more of a theological question. This is what happens when you answer a question, you get a follow-up question. When you image of God, what does that mean to you? Because the image of God, right, can be as a physical image, as a sort of the image in some other way. What does that mean to you? Okay. Okay. So more cognitive type of image you have in mind. Okay. Other thoughts or other responses to that thought? Thank you. Yes.
When I think of image in the garden,
Mm-hmm.
as a Christian, we were created as physical beings.
Yeah.
We were given a cultural mandate. We were given a mandate to subdue and also to cultivate the earth. So there is definitely a physical component to the imagery as well.
Okay. So for the purpose of the recording, in the garden, there is physical manifestation of the image bearing that we can see with our eyes. And it's not just maybe characteristics of the mind or of the brain, but actually something physical. Okay. Other thoughts or reactions to those thoughts? Aaron. Oh, up and down. Good. So we will get to that. Have this conversation more about human value because we're talking about, are human beings valuable? Thinking about what or who is a human being. This slide may be challenging, but I want to ask you this question. Is this an image bearer of God? Is this a human being? So this is a recently fertilized egg, human zygote. Is this an image bearer of God? Or is this a member of Homo sapiens? Is this a human being? Anybody want to take and again, there are no wrong answers. We're just figuring this out together. This one was challenging for me, I have to say. This is the thing that I've been working on and we've been talking about for a long time. Tim and I have been talking about for a long time. Any initial impressions, feelings, or other musings you have? Is this a picture of a human being?
Yes. It's encoded in their DNA, or our DNA.
Okay.
I'm married to a geneticist.
Okay.
I have to say something.
Okay. So for the recording, yes, because we actually have something about our genetic code that identifies us as Homo sapien. Okay. So you would say yes. Okay, based on that. Okay. You can play devil's advocate. Well, I could see some people are not, saying this isn't a member of Homo sapiens because, even if you don't believe that. What might be some rebuke to say, no way, this is not a member of Homo sapiens? What might someone say that, do you think? Haven't human experiences yet. Okay. Okay. Okay, isn't able to breathe. Okay. Certain capacities to think or to feel. Okay. Potential. Okay. So watch for that language on potentiality. This is a potential person. This is a potential human, right? Because those words can be used to justify certain actions or certain ways of treating members of Homo sapiens. Erin? Wouldn't be able to exist on its own. Okay, good. I like all of these things. So, when I've shown pictures like this before, many sort of objections to this not being a member of Homo sapiens are things that you've said, right? People say, this is clearly not one of us. And I would ask, well, why not? And some of these qualifiers. So what qualifiers do you have in your mind for what constitutes a human being? And maybe if you have certain qualifiers, I would ask, are they arbitrary? Are they ageist? Are they ableist? So the question of when human life begins is a matter of biology, not one of opinion. And the scientific facts really are unambiguous. The life of a new human being initiates at the instant of sperm-egg fusion, and when some individuals definitely deny this conclusion, it's totally supported by the scientific literature. And as we just met recently, Dr. Maureen Kondik, she's a cell biologist, she has said, actually, which I think is super interesting, she says, as a society, we are not really struggling with the scientific facts of biology, facts that really no one credibly debates, but instead, we are grappling with the question of when does the responsibility for a life begin and end? And we have instead placed this more difficult question under the simpler heading of when does life begin? If you look at embryology textbooks going back as far as I can remember, the embryology textbooks and most embryologists will say actually the development of human beings begins with fertilization, a process by which the spermatozoon from the male and the oocyte from the female unite to give rise to a new organism, the zygote. But many people say, but the zygote embryo doesn't look like us, doesn't have limbs. Well, I might point out this person to you. This is Nick Vujicic. He doesn't have limbs. Is he not a human being? Or I could think of someone who's had a terrible burn, who might not have a face that recognizes the characteristics that you and I have. Are they not a human being? There was the question of awareness, self-awareness, right? You might say they have no awareness, they have no agency, they have no ability to sort of communicate, so they can't be a human being. I could take any one of you down the road to the hospital, right, and sedate you to sort of depress your level of consciousness. Do you cease to be a human being at that point? Is this child who's sedated and intubated not a human being? So what I would say to you, and we'll talk more about this value concept in a bit, but location, size, ability, if you're wanted, if you're not wanted, should not define and does not define what makes a human being. And my claim is this: that human beings begin at fertilization, and human beings have the right not to be killed at will. Inherent dignity as image bearers of God. And we should tremble at that fact and have fear at the thought of taking the life of one of the members of Homo sapiens, except in very, very rare circumstances. But the type of confusion that I showed you with a picture of the zygote and like a picture of one of us, right? That type of confusion about who has value doesn't come down just to that example. But actually, even more striking examples when the confusion should not be so great happens. So what if I gave you these pictures? And we commented a little bit about this before. What if I gave you a picture of the person, like the 45, let's say, year-old successful businessman who's a productive member of society, versus the person on the right, an 89-year-old female with dementia who's in the hospital with delirium? Would you say these people have equal value? Or what would society say, or what would someone say about their value? Equally valuable? Yes. Why yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. And so you're rooting this value in something. I think people fall into two categories, right? There are people who believe in something inherent to the human being, because all even if it's not a religious argument around Imago Dei, that all human beings are equally valued because of the very type of creature that they are. Something like that is what Tomasi would say, right? And then there are people who fall into the other camp. There's extrinsic human dignity, that you have human dignity because of some choice that society or people who have power choose to place upon you having value because of some attribute or some capacity or some type of status, right? Because the question I have for you really is this: who is included in the circle of the we? Who do we say we have value in society and who doesn't? The view of the human person is not based on the value on Imago Dei. It's going to be what people can do, what they can't do, and oftentimes in our US society is going to fall into a consumerist view. You have value because of if you can produce and you can consume, and anyone who falls out of that doesn't have value. And we also know that people who aren't going to have value are people whose dignity we find totally inconvenient. So we find some people's dignity frankly convenient. We all do it, right? People who may be homeless, the incarcerated person, the refugee, the migrant, the prenatal child, right? Someone with disability, someone with closed head injury. And I have seen a shift in medicine that, physicians are not immune to biases. People feel this way. There's this external thing, and not everyone has equal value. Physicians think the same way. And so I wanted to sort of shift to sort of think about the consequences of what can happen if you don't root human value in Imago Dei or something intrinsic to the person. So some of you know this story because I've presented on him before, but this is Michael Hickson. So Michael Hickson is a man pictured here with his wife Melissa, who was hospitalized in December of 2020 with COVID-19. And Michael Hickson, a few years before this picture was taken, had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And when he arrested, he was resuscitated, but had a resultant anoxic brain injury and had really significant physical and cognitive limitations. He was married to his wife Melissa, who's pictured here, had children, and then he was hospitalized with COVID-19. He was in Texas, and Melissa noticed that Michael was not getting IV medication, remdesivir, for his COVID. And so Melissa asked the physician, why is my husband not getting the medication? And the physician is on the video recording saying, it's because he doesn't have a quality of life. And Melissa's like, what do you mean? And the doctor says, it's because he's not a walking and talking person. And Michael Hickson died, right? So there are consequences to the way we view human value. And when people in power hold views, right, that are male-formed, people's lives literally can be at stake. And we know actually doctors can be incredibly ableist. If you show a doctor a picture of a person who has a disability, they will time and time again rate that person's quality of life much lower than if you ask the disabled person themselves, right? And so to give you an example of a physician, many of you know he is my person I pick on a little bit. This is Zeke Emanuel. So he's one of the biggest bioethicists in the country. He's an internist like myself. He's a bioethicist. He has an endowed chair at Penn. And he is a very prominent culture maker and shaper. And Zeke wrote this piece a few years ago that's pretty infamous about why he hopes to die at 75, right? And he says this is an argument that society, families, and you, so everybody, will be better off if nature takes its course swiftly and promptly. So why does he want to hope to die at 75 and hopes you die at 75 too? He says, here's the simple truth that many of us seem to resist. Living too long is a loss because you become disabled, which is a state that may not be worse than death, or it may be, right? But is nonetheless deprived. And you can't work, you can't be creative, and you're pathetic. You're pathetic. So, when you have one of the prominent, preeminent bioethicists in the country who has a pretty flagrant ableist, ageist worldview and isn't completely being called to task about this, it probably means that society actually agrees with him, right? This is in stark contrast to this piece, which I absolutely love, highly recommend. It's a classic piece. Gil Mylander, who's a Christian theologian, wrote this piece in First Things in March 2010, I Want to Burden My Loved Ones, which is a tongue-in-cheek piece. But he says in it actually the true value-ness of our humanness actually is found in these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving in dependence. We are all vulnerable. Autonomy is a myth. And this is how we flourish. And this is how we recognize human value, right? So stark contrast. And so you might say, well, Zeke Emanuel wrote this piece a long time ago. Does he still believe this? So he doubled down on this actually this winter, and I commented it on my Twitter because I just thought that it's as abhorrent to me now as it was several years ago, that he really thinks that older people have no value. And you might say, well, gosh, at like 85, 90, should we be, when we have resources that are limited, putting folks in ECMO and all this? He's not talking about ECMO, right? He's not talking about like all these things. He's like, no flu shots, no antibiotics, right? These people don't have value. They shouldn't be allowed to continue. So again, this matters because folks like Zeke Emanuel read during global pandemics and decide who gets medical resources and who doesn't. And when you have an ableist, ageist worldview, your policies are probably going to be ableist and ageist, and no one even gives a second chance, right? So this is a paper most of us read in the New England Medicine during the pandemic about how to allocate scarce resources during the pandemic. And so Dr. Emanuel says these are the values that you should use to decide who gets things. You should maximize benefits, you should treat equally, you should promote instrumental value, which would be sort of giving more sort of resources to someone sort of good versus Hitler, right? And giving priority to the worst off. And I read these and I thought these were pretty reasonable until I drilled down. And he says, who is the worst off? Giving priority to the worst off could be understood as giving priority to the sickest, which most of us in medicine recognize as like triage, which is reasonable, or to younger people. And again, I've been in medicine for over 20 years, and I never thought about the worst off being the younger people. But you would, right, if you're an ageist, right? So what are the consequences of having different ways of how we view human value? Or maybe not even, some people don't think humans have value at all. I know that sounds shocking, but actually, like, some people think like we actually have no special value compared to other, like, non-human animals. Well, the consequences that I've seen in medicine is like you come out of medicine not seeing people made in the image of God, or yourself being made in the image of God, but just a bunch of molecules in motion. And you think of yourself as a technician taking care of a complex machine. That's bad for patients, and that's bad for physicians. To take it to sort of the extreme, for those of you that want to explore this argument, Jeff Bishop, who's an MD PhD at SLU, wrote this book called The Anticipatory Core. Not only is the Imago Dei totally out of the, it's not even in the purview of medicine, but all the transcendents are out of the purview of medicine. And it's so bad, because we've lost all connection with the transcendent goods, actually, that the dead body actually is normative in medicine. And he says actually that's why the first patient in medical school is like your cadaver in gross anatomy, because the dead body is like the goal onto which all things in medicine are mapped. It's a little bit extreme. Jeff's like a philosopher, and he's really out there. But it's actually interesting to think about, actually, that we are all just anticipatory corpses. There's no eschaton, right? There's nothing else. So to give one last example of how our policies, I believe, actually in medicine recently have displayed an ageist, ableist tendency. We don't value, even though we say we might value all people the same, but we don't. I'm just going to tell you a story. This is de-identified, all of it. I'll say Mrs. Smith. So it was the beginning of the pandemic. I was taking care of patients. I'm a general internist, and I get a call from my patient, Mrs. Smith, from her daughter. I've taken care of Mrs. Smith forever. And the daughter says, Mrs. Smith is having trouble. She can't walk. And I said, well, I need to see her. And she's like, no, she can't walk. And it was just as Michigan Medicine was wrapping up the video visits. And so we got a video visit set up. I saw Mrs. Smith for the first time ever in her home, right? Surrounded by like 7 or 8 children, pets, everyone, right? And so after talking to Mrs. Smith for a little bit of time, I thought she had a neurologic emergency. I thought she had cord compression. So it's when the spinal cord is being pressed upon by a tumor, and if you don't use emergent radiation and corticosteroids, you could die of paralysis. I said, I think you need to go to the hospital. And she said, I'm not going. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, I'm not going into that hospital alone. So this was at the time our visitor policies had been created. And if many of you remember during that time, for our adult patients, like you couldn't have anyone with you in the hospital unless you could have one person if you were actively dying. My patient had limited English proficiency. She had hard of hearing. She couldn't see very well. She had limited memory. And she knew if she went to that hospital, and she probably knew she was going to die, but she'd be by herself, and then she'd have one person, and she wanted to be with her whole family. So we talked about the risks and benefits of all of this, and we decided to do home hospice for her, and she died. She died at home. So I wrote about this for America Magazine, how I said the visitor policies, I thought, incredibly disadvantaged my most vulnerable patients, especially the folks that people have decided are part of like throwaway culture, my older patients who have limited cognitive impairment and all that. And how I really think that in medicine, we really don't do a good enough job about teaching all doctors to value all human life equally. And we're just part of the culture, right? So for those of you that need one more data before we move on, if you think I'm making this up, there's this really good piece by Timmermans where they embedded researchers into hospital resuscitation bays and looked to see, did physicians resuscitate people all the same way? Surprisingly, the answer is no. So people come in out of hospital cardiac arrest. They don't have time to ask them like who you are, what your job is, but they can tell by looking at people, if they were deemed to be worthy of life. And the people that didn't get resuscitated as well were people who looked homeless, people who were older, people who looked disabled, people who looked like they had substance use disorder. And so all of us have some group of people, or people probably, that we probably see as socially dead to us. Their dignity is inconvenient, they're out of our sphere of concern, and we know from this study that social death predicts your cardiopulmonary death. So what happens if we lose the imago Dei, the idea that every person has inherent dignity and inviolable worth? I think if we do, some human beings are going to become victims of throwaway culture and literally be discarded as trash and will be killed. Physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia is not, in my opinion, in accordance with the term dignity, as I've been using it. It's an affront to human dignity. Directly aiming at the death of another member of Homo sapiens is violence and should not be part of healthcare. It is not healthcare, in my opinion. And thinking about this role of human value and how we teach human value, I've gone back and forth about this, but I do think actually, the laws have a pedagogical nature of teaching people about what we value in society. So think about the laws in some states that allow for physician-assisted suicide euthanasia. What does that teach the public? What does that teach the vulnerable? What does it teach people about the value of human life? So when I think about that, I think about, ideally, I think a government should have law that accurately reflects natural law, where that natural law tells us that every person, whatever their state of health is, mark on him, this man should not be killed. Susanna Black has written about this, and she says, in the past, when those laws existed, right, The law didn't ask you if you wanted it. The law told you something about yourself. That mark is still on people, right? That it's wrong to take your life and you are valuable. But the law no longer tells people that. And instead teaches you that you do not possess that quality, and you will probably be increasingly less likely to pick that up in others and yourself, right? And when the authorities of your society say there's nothing about you that's special that would prevent you from killing yourself, also, we really don't need you here. And actually, a lot of times in these things, it's actually called a noble act, right? Killing yourself is not going to do anyone else harm. And honestly, if you're a normal person, you probably are going to be affected by that. Because normal people are at least somewhat affected by what the authorities tell them. And this is most likely to affect probably the most vulnerable in our society as well, which we've seen in Canada. And I think about this, this tweet that I saw. So Dr. Lejeune was a French pediatrician and geneticist, and he said, "A day will come when clinics will have a sign on their door, 'Here we do not kill,' and patients will rush to these places of life." So the conversation around euthanasia especially has sparked important conversations, especially disability activists, about who we value and why. Because again, it's often the most vulnerable in our society that's affected by a throwaway culture, and one in which everyone's value is not recognized because of the sins of racism, ableism, and ageism. So just to sort of point that out a bit more about how this has infected medicine, so quality is quality adjusted life year. This is a term we use in health services research to decide what gets funded or not. One is 1 year in perfect health and 0 is dead. And so little increments down from that are basically, a year like in partially like a disabled life or not as healthy. And so people use these to make decisions about funding. And there was a really great op-ed a couple of weeks ago by a mom of a person with cystic fibrosis. And she called on Congress. She's like, you should ban the use of QALYs in healthcare coverage because they're frankly ableist, and there's no place for ableism within medicine. So what about transhumanism? Right? If we don't have a proper anthropology and a view of what makes a human being and what gives them value, again, if they have any value at all, then we'll be very much on board with every perversion of the human being that there is. And one form of that perversion that is very captivating for many people is the one of transhumanism. And transhumanism, as you know, arises from a worldview in which human nature has no special status, and in which it's not just legitimate, but actually morally necessary to use technology, especially biotechnology, to improve on that nature. And when we talk about transhumanism, it's like sci-fi, like we think about it something in the future, but actually transhumanism is already here. The birth control pill actually was the first transhumanist technology. And we're just actually on the cusp of all the possible ways the human being is going to be modified in years to come. We know, for example, like there's people who have totally healthy limbs, for example, that want them resected, for example, or taken off. Is this healthcare? And having this idea of the beauty of the human person can help us resist medicine that's not healthcare. I love this picture. But one beautiful thing about having your ethics based on Christian theological principles is the richness. Many of you are scientists. As you know, science and biology by themselves don't have a proper cosmology, beginning, or a telos, an end. They just are. And without a beginning, knowing where we came from, and an end, to whom we belong and where we go when we die, there can be no meaning. And without meaning, you end up defaulting to what you see today as the main type of bioethics, which is utilitarian ethics, one that's based solely on autonomy as the overriding principle. As long as I can give consent and it doesn't hurt others, anything's permissible. If I can give consent, for example, to kill myself, right, or have myself killed, what lesser things can I demand to and consent for? So Plow ran a piece, again, a few weeks ago by Benjamin Crosby about the disaster that's happening in Canada right now around euthanasia, medical aid and dying, and called us out. Where are the churches? Where are the Christians? It's a really good piece. And again, I want to say, and I have these conversations all the time when I talk with people about how to speak about their faith in their place of work, and people sometimes act as if it's like a liability or something to be ashamed of. And Christians, we have something radical, countercultural, and beautiful to say into the culture of death, and to not be afraid to do so, because literally people's lives are at stake. I think of Mother Teresa thinking about how she saw human value. And this picture of seeing this man who literally was part of probably throwaway culture, literally discarded as trash, and she's looking at him and seeing him in the fullness of who he is. So to sort of think about for me in medicine, I think human value is rooted in the Imago Dei. And also the human body itself has value as well. Matter matters because of the incarnation. We have a special dignity because we're human beings made in the image of God, but that dignity is intensified because of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Bodies matter because Jesus Christ had a body, has a body, and central to our faith are bodies. Alistair McIntyre, who's again a premier philosopher, has said modern medicine and bioethics has become totally forgetful of the body. Again, if this body is just bio stuff that has no meaning, anything's permissible. And what I've come to understand for myself and my practice is out of this respect for human value that I have, I believe that killing cannot and should not be part of medicine. So to wrap up and start taking your questions, I just want to briefly talk about the challenges that can happen when you have a distinctly Christian worldview. And I'm going to talk about just briefly what happened with the white coat ceremony at the University of Michigan this summer. And while this didn't just happen to me, it happened to a lot of our community. I just want to say that I don't have an ill will towards the students that walked out. I think in part they're part of an educational system that has failed them. So this summer I received this email from the dean's office saying that the Gold Human Honor Society and the faculty had elected me to be the white coat speaker at the white coat ceremony. For those of you who don't know, the white coat ceremony is a ceremony where we welcome our new medical students. They get their short white coats and they start med school the next day. As someone who went to med school at Michigan, this was a pretty big honor. Many people, faculty, think this is actually a bigger honor than being asked to be the graduation speaker because you're the first person that gets to welcome the students in. So I very quickly accepted. Shortly thereafter, a piece had been published that I had been interviewed for The Pillar, which is a Catholic publication, talking about that I'm a convert to Christianity a few years ago and a pro-life convert. And I think it was actually on the same day that Roe versus Wade was overturned. So this was right around the time I got picked to be the white coat speaker. Actually, I was in Ottawa, Canada, giving a talk for Canadian Physicians for Life, and I heard that there were some rumblings coming into the dean's office that I was the white coat speaker. People were unhappy about it because of my views on abortion. So a petition started by some incoming students, current students, some faculty, and some staff. And they basically demanded that I be removed as a speaker from the white coat ceremony. I wasn't even going to be speaking on abortion. But the students didn't believe that someone who was a pro-life person in medicine should give a talk to physicians, future physicians. And the end of the petition said, we demand U of M support reproductive justice, and we demand an alternative speaker. And every day, I walked by this sign that said, every voice counts. Right? Our community depends on it. And for nearly 2 centuries, it says U of M has been built on having diverse voices in the community. And it was just really hard because here I was, someone who had a voice, and I was definitely, I think, a voice that was in the minority of people at U of M, but still, I was elected to be the person, and there was a lot of stress around this decision. So if any of you find yourself in this situation, U of M actually has a pretty strong freedom of speech and artistic expression statement in the faculty handbook. So I knew I actually had a right to speak, right? So they say expression of diverse points of view is of the highest importance. The belief that an opinion is pernicious cannot be grounds for its suppression. And so there was a lot of conversation through the dean's office and different stakeholders of whether or not I should be allowed to speak. Many of you know that the dean's office actually supported the talk. And they said they've gotten feedback from both sides, but I was never going to speak on abortion, and our values actually speak about honoring the critical importance of diversity of personal thought and ideas, and they would never revoke someone's invitation to speak because they have different ideas than somebody else. So after that, I was invited to all the White Coat Planning Committee meetings. I was assigned a bodyguard. There was a security plan. There were all these contingency plans of what was going to happen. Tim and I had to decide if we were going to bring the boys to the ceremony. And I thought if I can just get through the talk, then everything's going to be fine. As many of you know, actually, when I came up to the podium to give the comments, a section of the audience stood and walked out. And it was recorded, and that video went viral on social media. So the next day, Tim and I woke up to it being all over the news. And it was a pretty stressful time during that time. And I think about, we made a very quick decision, actually I wasn't going to talk to any news. I didn't talk to any media. No podcasts, no print media, nothing. But I just think about, and again, I know this is a controversial topic, but The fact that in medicine, as a pro-life person, that I had death threats and have a bodyguard for being a pro-life person in medicine, to me, just I think shows how far like we've come and drifted away actually from the good of medicine. So I decided to do no media after that point. Just to give you an example of what that looked like, NPR reached out and they wanted to comment, and I said no. So they probably sent their sort of intern to go find something about Collier to put on the paper or whatever. So someone said, Collier is a frequent speaker and panelist on issues of bioethics in the world of spirituality and healthcare. And on her Twitter, she's written about racism, ageism, and ableism in medicine, and advocates for better healthcare access for incarcerated people. And I was like, that's awesome, you know? Like, that's like the best thing. So again, like, let your work speak for itself. And I think about all the time Jesus was silent, and all the space it makes for grace and mercy in these situations. So just a couple slides left. So if you're thinking about, you're feeling convicted about speaking up for the value of human life as you see it, and I think as we're called to see it, how do you do that? So the couple practical tips I have for you, so it's not just some philosophical thing. Talk about what you're for, you know? So I don't go into a space and say like, I'm anti this, I want to take away this, and I don't think we should do this, right? I say what I'm for. I'm actually for expansion of rights to the most vulnerable members of Homo sapiens. I'm actually for making more space in society for moms and babies, you know? And so a way for you to remember that is you want to be pro-grandpa, not anti-donut. I know many of you heard me say this before. I think it's such a cool example. Again, I learned this from somebody else. So when you say you're for something, it's going to go on someone's ears much easier than if you say I'm against something. So the example is if I were sort of in the room with a box of donuts, and I handed you a donut, and you said, I don't want a donut, and I'm like, who doesn't want a donut? And you're like, well, I'm anti-donut. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, who is this person? Right? But then if I instead gave you the donut and I said, would you like a donut? And you're like, I'm going to pass. I'm like, well, why are you passing on the donut? And you said, well, actually, my grandpa just turned 75 last week, and his birthday party, he said in his 75th year, he wants to run a 5K with me. And so because we're going to run the 5K, we're going to have a healthier diet. And so because of that, I'm so pro my grandpa, I'm passing on the donut. And I'm like, that's so cute. They're like for their grandpa and all this stuff, right? So like you're pro grandpa, you're not anti-donut. It's like the same thing, it's just the way that it's phrased, right? And then this is the beauty of this group here is like, you have to have your friends, you know? You can't do this by yourself. And I recognized my privilege immensely in the white coat ceremony of what happened, of me being able to call on a very wide network of people across the country who were able to help me. But that network starts now, right? It starts now. And people said, well, how did you get through that time? I really could not have gotten through that time without the prayers of so many people. But this one scripture came into my mind the most. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So to finish up, if you are pro-life, again, I know this is a controversial term, are pro-life the new extremists? You will be called an extremist if you have a view of human life, actually, that's broad, that you think the tent's huge and actually all Homo sapiens are under it. I don't know why that's so controversial, but it is controversial. It's extremely controversial. And you'll be called an extremist. And what I would say is it's always okay to be an extremist for good. Charlie Camosi tweeted this last year, so my last slide said, Mother Cabrini, this is America, Cabrini said. We are bold or we die. Think about what's happening in Canada and how the churches and Christians are not being bold up there, right? I used to think this was hyperbole, but honestly, over the past year or so of what I've seen, this is not hyperbole. If we are not bold for what we believe about the inherent value and inherent dignity of all human beings, people are dying and will continue to die. Thanks so much.